Let me tell you everything before you judge us. This story is not an event that happened at once, it was something that grew quietly over the years, something I tried to hide but finally broke out that evening when Jake called me Mom. That changed everything. Now, a few weeks have passed since that moment, and the tension of that night has still not lifted from me. When I left the bedroom, I knew how complicated things were inside me, but I didn't want to project it outside. I put on my robe, my hair was falling loosely over my shoulders. The weight of life, which I had been tired of throughout the day, had not lightened for a moment. As my footsteps echoed through the house, everything should have changed as soon as possible. I quickly moved towards the corridor, but at that moment, I noticed something. Jake, right in front of me, was approaching me with a deep gaze. I paid attention to my own body for a moment. His rapidly rejuvenating muscular body bore the traces of the years he had lived, but on the one hand, his tense, trembling gaze indicated that he had grown up and matured. It was so strong that it was almost impossible to resist, but the restlessness in his eyes was an indication that everything was wrong, that everything he knew was on a limit. Suddenly, Jake took a few steps towards me. He was so close I felt his breath, my heart started to beat fast. I didn't know what to do at that moment. Everything was getting bigger every second. My son had become a different man from me now, with muscular shoulders and a strong gaze. When they all came together, I wanted him to get a little closer to me, but on the one hand, I wanted to stay away from him. Jake took a step and came closer to me and said, "Mom, you don't have to." His voice was soft but determined, watching me come so close. It reminded me of how much his life had changed. He looked deep into my eyes and said, "You don't have to continue with this life." For a moment, it felt like my heart was going to break out of place. On the one hand, there was the storm inside me, on the other hand, the fact that we were so close. My feelings were mixed, but there was something I felt: if we got any closer, something would explode. "Jake, stop," I said, but my voice came out trembling. "Don't be so close, this is not true." At that moment, I felt that everything could get out of control. I quickly got up from my seat and said, "That's enough," and headed for the bathroom. My heart was beating wildly, I was having difficulty breathing. I was afraid he was going to follow me, but when I heard footsteps coming after him, I felt a little relieved. I quickly closed the bathroom door, and washed my face by pouring cold water on my hands. For a moment, I just felt the coldness of the water, but I couldn't figure out what I should do. Jake's gaze was still inside me, but it was a temporary solution. No matter how much I ran away, no matter how much I tried to stay away, something was starting to change, and now nothing would ever be the same again. The time I spent in the bathroom gave me a feeling of relief, but while the cold water stimulated my skin, it made the emotional turmoil inside me quite obvious. My thoughts were growing like an avalanche. On the one hand, what Jake is telling me is true, the determination in his voice and that closeness. On the other side is the feeling that everything doesn't mean anything. During this period of time without Richard, my husband, at home, under the water, I leaned my head forward and pressed my hands against the cold surfaces on my chest, saying, "What is this happening to me?" I whispered. My voice mingled with the noise of the water, but it echoed in my heart. Yes, my husband was not at home, he was on a business trip. But lately, the bond between Richard and me has been decaying. That excitement and love from years ago had been almost completely erased. Everything had become a habit. We felt as if we existed for each other only physically. The decoupling grew. Now, in the face of Jake's looks and what he was saying, I could feel that something had changed inside me, but it was so complicated. On the one hand, my son, the love I feel for him, and the tension in that scene. On the other hand, the feeling of exhaustion I feel towards Richard. I slowly turned off the shower and tried not to get lost in these thoughts. While decanting the water, I took a deep breath and left the bathroom. I had to look at myself in the mirror for a short time. My hair was wet, I had a slight wrinkle on my face. But still, from what I saw in the mirror, I had not lost my identity. As I slowly put on my clothes, I tried to make sense of the mess inside me. As the hot water of the shower disappeared into my body, the emotional turmoil of the moment was replaced by a physical relaxation. But the restlessness in me was not going away. When I came out of the bathroom, no matter how much I tried to look normal, it was impossible to escape this tension inside me. I put on a pair of short shorts and a singlet with a strap. Then I took my steps in the direction of the kitchen. Every step of the way, the cold look in Jake's eyes and the words he said echoed in my mind. It was as if I felt how close everything was, and how far away it was. When I opened the kitchen door, Jake was only lifting his head to look at me. It was another manifestation of the tension between us. December in a breezy silence, we were just watching each other. As he stepped towards me, his gaze was like both a threat and a call. "Mom," he said, his voice hard and emotional. "Again, we can't hide this anymore. You have to leave the life you are living. There is no other way." His words enveloped everything inside me, stopping the beating of my heart for a moment. While my eyes were frozen for a moment in response to Jake's cold-blooded attitude, I realized that it was impossible to hide things any longer. But just then, a voice came through. "Ugh, the door." "Richard, I think I forgot my passport," he said. His words began to break like an iceberg, intensifying the tension in the room even more. There was a brief look of bewilderment in her eyes, but rather than realizing the dynamics of that moment, I felt only a temporary emptiness. Jake and I walked away from each other without saying anything. He quickly left while I went to Richard and took his passport. I said, "Have a nice trip," but there was so much going on inside me that the words got stuck in my throat. Richard left without realizing anything. I felt that he did not ask about things as he closed the door. At that moment, I realized how deep the tension and confusion were. In the evening, I started to prepare dinner, but in the kitchen, even though I wanted to somehow act as if everything was normal to provide comfort on the surface, the restlessness in me was continuing. "Jake, when you eat, it looked like they covered everything but the kindness in your voice. Everything was dominated by the voltage in the look. How innocently we are eating, despite the fact that the distance from each other was noticeable even at the dinner table." For a moment, I found myself lying thoughtfully on the bed. I slowly got out of bed and headed for the bathroom. At that time, I noticed something. Jake had quietly entered his mother's room. I heard his steps, but there was still a deep silence in the room. When I realized that the door to my bedroom had been opened, my heart suddenly began to beat fast. When Jake walked in, I felt the determination in his eyes again. At that moment, "Mother," he said, "I can't go on with you like this. We are aware of everything. You should leave your life with your husband behind." His mother, waking up quickly, felt her heart start to beat rapidly when she heard these words. The fear and uncertainty in him suddenly became heavy. His son's gaze reminded her of how complicated and changed everything had become. She seemed a little relieved that her husband was not at home, but Jake's presence was shaking her marriage, which she hoped would return at any moment, making the mess inside her even bigger. "Jake," she said, her voice trembling, "we can't do that. My husband will return. If he knows everything, I can't accept this." What he said revealed the deep conflict inside him. He felt himself in a predicament. After listening attentively to his mother's fears, Jake turned his eyes to her and came a little closer. "But Mother," he said, "you can't prevent it. No matter how much you resist, I know you're in this. You feel it too." His mother's eyes clouded even more. For a moment, what Jake said was complicating her feelings even more, but at that time, the fear inside her turned to her as she thought that everything would slip away, that her husband would return at any moment. "Go," he said, unable to control the tremor in his voice. "If my husband comes, it will all be over. Please go." Jake watched his mother's fear and helplessness. For a moment then, he took a deep breath and left the room. Without making a sound, everything fell into silence. His mother took a deep breath after Jake left the room, but the confusion inside her wouldn't go away. She felt that everything was out of control now that her marriage and her relationships were changing too. When he went to the bathroom, he remembered that Richard had still not arrived. This caused him to relax a little, but the uneasiness inside him was growing more and more every minute.